Imagine this. You're walking through the silent corridors of your own mind. Every turn, every shadowed corner reveals something strange, something that's always been there. Yet you've never dared to face it. Most of us like to believe we're in control of our thoughts, our feelings, our choices. But what if that control is only an illusion? What if the deepest layers of your psyche are quietly shaping your fears, your decisions, even your destiny, without you realizing it? That's what we're diving into today. 7 dangerous psychological territories inspired by the work of Carl Jung. Ignore them, and they can silently sabotage your life. Confront them, and they can transform you. And I'll warn you now, the final one is the most dangerous of all. But it's also the most liberating, if you're brave enough to face it. Before we begin, please make sure to subscribe, hit the like button, and share your thoughts in the comments. Because this isn't just a lecture, this is a dialogue with your unconscious. And by the time you finish this journey, you may never look at your dreams, your relationships, or even yourself the same way again. Carl Jung's map of the psyche. Carl Jung, one of the giants of psychology, believed the human mind is far deeper than we imagine. Freud focused on repression and hidden drives, but Jung gave us a map filled with symbols, myths, archetypes, and shadows. For Jung, the unconscious wasn't just a garbage bin of forgotten memories. He saw it as a living realm, filled with raw instincts, ancient images, and truths we've buried. A realm that can either awaken us to extraordinary growth or drag us into despair. Think about it. How many times have you found yourself repeating patterns you swore you'd never repeat? Falling into the same kind of relationship, chasing the same destructive habits, or walking down a path that feels strangely predetermined, as if someone else was pulling the strings. Jung would say those aren't coincidences. Those are forces of the unconscious, what he called complexes, shadow projections, archetypal energies, quietly guiding your life. And until you bring them into awareness, they rule you. So let's begin. The shadow. The first dangerous territory is the shadow. The shadow is everything in you that you reject, repress, or deny. It's the envy you never admit, the anger you swallow, the impulses you're terrified anyone might see. And here's the warning. What you refuse to face in yourself will eventually show up in your outer life. That's why people project hatred onto others. They're really battling their own hidden qualities. That's why leaders often fall from grace for the very flaws they condemned. The shadow is dangerous not because it's evil, but because it's unconscious. What you bury becomes more powerful than what you acknowledge. Ask yourself, what qualities in others irritate you the most? What behaviors in society make your blood boil? Jung would say, look closer. Chances are some part of that lives inside you too. But here's the paradox. When you face the shadow instead of hiding from it, it becomes a source of creativity, authenticity, and strength. Integration is the key. Complexes next. We enter the territory of complexes. A complex is like a knot of emotions and memories buried in your unconscious, often formed from childhood wounds. Picture someone with an abandonment complex. Even as an adult, they panic at the smallest sign of rejection. They misinterpret words, sabotage relationships, all because that hidden wound is pulling the strings. Or think of a power complex, someone who constantly dominates others, not because they're strong, but because deep down they feel powerless. Complexes are chilling because, as Jung said, we don't have complexes. Complexes have us. They hijack your decisions without you even knowing. And until you acknowledge them, you're basically living on repeat, trapped in loops of the past. Anima and animus. The third territory is the anima and animus, the inner feminine in men and the inner masculine in women. When these forces remain unconscious, they wreak havoc in our relationships. Man who hasn't integrated his anima may either idolize women as flawless goddesses or demonize them as destructive temptresses. Neither is real. A woman who hasn't integrated her animus may project impossible expectations onto men, or struggle endlessly with authority and inner direction. In both cases, we're not relating to real people. We're relating to our own projections, and that's why relationships fall apart, because we're not seeing our partner. We're seeing an unconscious figure acting through them. But when you integrate your anima or animus, they become bridges to wholeness, to creativity, and to authentic intimacy. Transition to part 2, we've stepped into 3 of Jung's most perilous territories: the shadow, complexes, and the anima animus. Each one is a trap if ignored, but a treasure when integrated. But we're not done. In the next part, we'll explore the forces that shape entire destinies, the archetypes, the collective unconscious, and the masks we wear every day. And finally, we'll approach the most dangerous place of all, the confrontation with the self. So stay with me, because the deeper we go, the more the mind reveals. Part 2, Archetypes, Masks, and the Collective Mind. We've already uncovered 3 of Jung's most perilous psychological landscapes: the shadow, complexes, and the anima animus. Each one hides in the dark, silently shaping our lives. But now we go even deeper, into forces that don't just affect individuals, but entire cultures. These are the powers of archetypes, the collective unconscious, and the persona. Ignore them, and you risk living a life that isn't even yours. Archetypes are universal patterns, timeless images and roles that appear in myths, religions, and stories across every culture. The hero, the mother, the trickster, the wise old man. They live inside the collective psyche, waiting to play out through us. Now here's the danger. When an archetype takes hold of you unconsciously, it can consume your entire personality. Think of the hero. At its best, it gives courage, discipline, and resilience. But left unchecked, it drives people into reckless battles, endless risk-taking, or a savior complex, believing they alone must rescue the world, or the mother. At its best, nurturing and life-giving. But in its dark form, it suffocates, controls, and sacrifices itself entirely for others. The peril isn't in the archetypes themselves. They aren't good or bad. They're raw psychic energy. The danger comes when we don't realize they're at work. Then, we're not living consciously. We're acting out a myth we didn't choose. Ask yourself, have you ever felt like you were playing a role larger than yourself? As if you were swept up in a story you couldn't escape. That's the grip of the archetype. The collective unconscious beyond. Personal memory lies something far more mysterious. The collective unconscious. This is Jung's most radical idea. That beneath our individual minds, we all share a vast reservoir of symbols and instincts inherited from the whole of humanity. That's why people across cultures dream of the same symbols: serpents, floods, radiant light. That's why myths from opposite sides of the globe echo the same stories. But here's the danger. When the collective unconscious rises up, individuality can vanish. Jung observed this in mass movements, wars, and fanaticism. Suddenly people think, speak, and act alike, as though possessed by an impersonal force. Entire nations can fall under archetypal possession, and on a personal level, you can lose yourself by merging into society's expectations, living out roles that aren't truly yours. The subtle danger is this: you stop being you. You become a fragment of a collective story. The persona now, let's talk about the mask you wear every day. The persona. The persona is the social face you present to the world. At work, with family, among friends, you shift masks to fit the role. And that's not always bad. Masks help us communicate and adapt. But here's Jung's warning. When you identify too strongly with your persona, you forget who you are behind the mask. You become the mask. Think of the professional who lives only for their title, the celebrity who believes they're nothing without fame, the parent who erases every part of themselves to fit society's expectations. When the mask shatters, as it always does, when jobs end, fame fades, or roles change, the collapse feels like death. And here's the twist. The brighter and more polished the persona, the darker the shadow hiding behind it. That's why those who seem perfect often carry hidden struggles beneath the surface. The persona is necessary, but dangerous when mistaken for the whole self. To live authentically, you must know where the mask ends and where you begin. Transition to part 3. We've now traveled through 6 perilous landscapes of the psyche. The shadow, complexes, the anima animus, archetypes, the collective unconscious, and the persona. Each one threatens to consume you if ignored. But Jung didn't stop here. He revealed one final place, the most dangerous, the most transformative, and the hardest to face, the confrontation with the self. In part 3, we'll step into this ultimate territory, where the ego itself must bow, and where danger and liberation meet. Part 3, the confrontation with the self. We've walked through the shadows, complexes, archetypes, and masks. Each of them is dangerous in its own way. But now we arrive at the most perilous territory Carl Jung described, the confrontation with the self. This isn't just another part of the psyche. The self is the center and totality of who you are, both conscious and unconscious. It's the hidden nucleus of your being, and to face it is nothing less than a confrontation with truth itself. The illusion of the ego. For most of your life, your ego believes it's in charge. It tells stories about who you are, your values, your role in the world, your identity. But Jung insisted the ego is not the master. It's only a servant. The self, the larger totality of your psyche, holds the real power. And when the ego meets the self, it feels like death. Old patterns collapse. Certainties dissolve. The mask of the persona shatters. Life as you knew it no longer makes sense. This is why Jung compared the confrontation with the self to ancient myths of death and rebirth. The hero must descend into the underworld, face monsters, and let the old self die. Only then can renewal begin. The danger of meeting the self, make no mistake. This is not a gentle awakening. It can feel like annihilation. Jung warned that without preparation, without grounding, people could be overwhelmed, even driven to madness by the flood of unconscious material. The ego resists desperately. It clings to illusions. It fights the pull of the self. And for many, that resistance creates immense suffering, depression, anxiety, emptiness. But here's the paradox. Those very symptoms can be signals that the ego is out of alignment with the self. They are messages calling you to listen more deeply. Individuation, the path to wholeness. So, why face the self if it's so dangerous? Because within that danger lies the possibility of wholeness. Jung called this process individuation, the lifelong journey of integrating the conscious and unconscious, becoming a complete person rather than a fragmented one. Individuation isn't about perfection. It's about balance. It's about acknowledging your shadow instead of denying it, listening to your complexes instead of being ruled by them, integrating the anima or animus instead of projecting them, recognizing archetypes instead of being possessed by them, and above all, living in harmony with the self, rather than fighting it. Symbols as guides. Jung believed that symbols are the signposts that guide us through this dangerous passage. Dreams, myths, art, even religious images often carry the voice of the self. One powerful example is the mandala, a circular symbol of wholeness. Jung found it appeared again and again in his patients' dreams. He saw it as the psyche's attempt to restore balance. Paying attention to such symbols allows the unconscious to speak. Ignoring them cuts us off from one of the greatest sources of guidance in our inner life. Transition to part 4. The confrontation with the self is terrifying. Yes, but it is also the gateway to transformation. It strips away everything false, leaving only what is authentic. In the next part, we'll explore what happens when you walk through this fire, how the collapse of the ego gives birth to a deeper identity, and why Jung saw this as not just psychology, but a spiritual awakening. Part 4. Death, Rebirth, and Transformation. Standing before the self is like standing at the edge of a great abyss. The ego trembles because it senses what's about to happen. The old you cannot survive this encounter. But here's the truth. What feels like death is actually the beginning of rebirth. Ego death. The collapse of illusion. Think. Of all the ways your ego has defined you, your job title, your reputation, your relationships, your possessions, the ego builds a story around these, insisting, "This is who I am." But when the self rises, those illusions shatter. The career ends. The mask of perfection cracks. The roles you clung to dissolve. And suddenly, the ego realizes it was never the ruler, only a fragment of something larger. This collapse can feel like annihilation. People describe it as emptiness, loss of meaning, even madness. Jung warned that this moment is one of the most dangerous passages of human life. Without awareness, people can be swept into despair, addictions, or destructive patterns as they try to numb the pain, the path through darkness. So why not run? Why not avoid the self altogether? Because avoidance is its own prison. The shadow grows stronger. The complexes rule your life. You remain trapped in cycles of suffering. The only way forward is through. Just as the hero in myth must descend into the underworld, face monsters, and endure trials before returning with treasure, so must we walk through our own psychic darkness. The treasure is not material. It is authenticity. It is wholeness. The rebirth. Living from the self, when the ego finally surrenders, something new emerges. This is rebirth. A deeper identity takes shape. One not built on roles, masks, or projections, but on the totality of who you are. The self becomes your guide. Life doesn't become easier, but it becomes more real. You live with authenticity, not performance. You carry your shadow consciously, instead of projecting it onto others. You relate to people as they are, not as you imagine them to be. You act with courage because you know fear is part of you, not your master. This is what Jung called individuation in its fullest form, becoming whole, transformation, and meaning for Jung. Psychology was never just about reducing symptoms. It was about transformation. He often drew parallels between individuation and spiritual awakening. The self is not only psychological, it borders on the divine. In fact, Jung saw many religious symbols, gods, mandalas, myths of death and rebirth, as echoes of this inner process. The confrontation with the self is dangerous precisely because it strips you bare. But in that stripping away, you discover meaning deeper than anything the ego could invent. Transition to Part 5. We've now seen the danger and the gift of facing the self. Ego death, the night of the soul, and finally, rebirth into wholeness. In the final part, we'll bring everything together. We'll revisit the 7 dangerous places, the shadow, complexes, anima, animus, archetypes, the collective unconscious, the persona, and the self, and reveal how each one, while perilous, carries the seed of transformation. Stay with me, because the conclusion may change how you see both your struggles and your potential forever. Part 5. The 7 dangerous places and the promise of transformation. We have now walked through Jung's 7 dangerous psychological territories: the shadow, complexes, anima, and animus, archetypes, the collective unconscious, the persona, and finally, the self. Each one holds danger. Each one has the power to overwhelm the fragile ego. And yet each also carries the seed of transformation. Revisiting the 7, the shadow. Left unacknowledged, it poisons relationships, fuels hatred, and blinds us to our flaws. But when integrated, it becomes a wellspring of creativity and authenticity. Complexes. These emotional knots sabotage our lives, trapping us in loops of old wounds. But recognized, they point us toward healing. Anima and animus. Unconscious, they distort our relationships. Integrated, they give us inner balance and deeper love. Archetypes. Unconscious, they sweep us into roles we didn't choose. Conscious, they inspire wisdom, courage, and meaning. The collective unconscious, overwhelming, it erases individuality. Yet it also connects us to the timeless story of humanity. The persona. Clung to too tightly, it makes us prisoners of a mask. But used consciously, it becomes a tool rather than a prison. The self, the most dangerous of all. To meet it is to let the ego die. But in that death comes rebirth, wholeness, and a life rooted in truth. The key lesson: Jung never told us to avoid these places. He warned that if we refuse to face them, they will rule us from the shadows. The only way forward is through. Danger and growth are inseparable. Pain and awakening are 2 sides of the same coin. As Jung himself said, there is no coming to consciousness without pain. The choice before you, so ask yourself, what is the cost of never facing these places? How much of your suffering comes not from the outside world, but from what you've refused to examine inside yourself? And more importantly, what could your life look like if you did face them? If you embraced the shadow, untangled your complexes, integrated your inner opposites, and stepped into the wholeness of the self. This isn't just psychology. It's the path to freedom, the ripple effect. And here's the deeper truth: when individuals transform, the world transforms. When you integrate yourself, you stop projecting your darkness onto others. You become less susceptible to collective hysteria. You bring more authenticity, more compassion, more courage into the world. Inner transformation ripples outward. And in a time when so many feel lost and fragmented, that ripple may be the most important thing of all. Final words, so the choice is yours. You can bury the shadow, deny the complexes, cling to the mask of the persona, and avoid the self. Many do. But the cost is high. A life lived in fragments, ruled by unconscious forces. Or you can walk into the dangerous places of the psyche with courage. You can dare to explore, dare to confront. And in doing so, you may discover the person you were always meant to become. The mind is not a safe place. But within its dangers lie the seeds of greatness, authenticity, and truth. So, what about you? Which of these 7 places feels most alive in your journey right now? Share your reflections in the comments. Your story may be the mirror someone else needs to face their own. And if this exploration has resonated with you, remember to subscribe, like, and share it, so we can continue building a community of genuine seekers. Not of shallow answers, but of real depth, because in the end, the greatest adventure is not out there. It's in here. Conclusion. The dangerous gift of the psyche. We've journeyed through Jung's 7 dangerous places: the shadow, complexes, the anima and animus, archetypes, the collective unconscious, the persona, and finally, the self. Each of these territories carries risk. Each has the power to overwhelm, to destabilize, to frighten. But here's the paradox. The very dangers we fear are the keys to our liberation. The shadow, once faced, gives birth to creativity. Complexes, once understood, point us toward healing. The anima and animus, once integrated, create inner balance and authentic love. Archetypes, once made conscious, give us wisdom and meaning. The collective unconscious, once respected, connects us to humanity's timeless story. The persona, once recognized as only a mask, frees us to live authentically. And the self, the most dangerous of all, once embraced, brings wholeness, depth, and a life of truth. Carl Jung never promised safety. He promised transformation. And he reminded us that there is no coming to consciousness without pain. So now the choice is yours. Will you turn away from the dark corridors of your own mind, hoping they will leave you alone? Or will you step into them with courage, knowing that every danger holds a treasure? Because within the dangers of the psyche lie the seeds of authenticity, purpose, and freedom. And in daring to face them, you may just discover the person you were always meant to be.